The year was 1878. Winter was just beginning to loosen its grip on the Colorado Rockies, leaving behind muddy trails and melting snowcaps. It should have been a time of renewed hope. Instead, it would become a season of unspeakable horror. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When Marshal Ethan Blackwood first rode up to what remained of the Dawson wagon train, he expected to find abandoned supplies, maybe signs of an Indian attack. What he discovered defied explanation. 10 wagons stood in a perfect circle, as if prepared for a defensive stand. Inside that circle lay 23 bodies, men, women, and children, slaughtered in ways that turned even the hardened lawman's stomach. But it was what Blackwood didn't find that haunted him most. No bullet. Casings, no arrows, no tracks of horses or men approaching or leaving the site. Just a set of strange, elongated footprints, unlike anything he'd ever seen before, leading away from the carnage and up toward the towering peaks of Shadow Mountain. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some evils should remain buried. Marshal. Blackwood was about to learn this lesson the hard way. Marshal Ethan Blackwood had been tracking outlaws for 17 years. The lines etched into his weathered face told stories of endless pursuits across unforgiving terrain, of shootouts at dawn, and of more burials than any man should have to attend in one lifetime. At 45, his dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and the old bullet wound in his left shoulder ached fiercely in cold weather. But his eyes remained sharp, his hands steady, and his reputation as the finest tracker in the Colorado Territory uncontested. When the telegram arrived in the dusty outpost of Pine Hollow, Blackwood had been nursing a whiskey at the Silver Dollar saloon, contemplating retirement for perhaps the 100th time. "Marshal," Sheriff Thomas Miller said, sliding the yellow paper across the bar. "Just came in from Silverton Pass. The Dawson wagon train was due 3 days ago. Never showed." Blackwood glanced at the telegram without touching it. "Probably got delayed by the spring thaw. Trails up there turn to soup this time of year." Miller shook his head. "Jacob Dawson's been making that supply run for 15 years. Never been more than a day late. Something's wrong." Blackwood drained his glass. "Who'd you send?" "Deputy Walters and 2 volunteers rode out yesterday morning. Should have been back by now." A heavy silence fell between the men. Both knew what this meant. "I'll head out at first light," Blackwood said finally. "Take Collins with you," Miller suggested. "Boy's green, but he's a good shot." Blackwood stood, dropping coins on the counter. "I ride alone, Tom. You know that." The next morning it was clear and cold. Blackwood's breath plumed in the pre-dawn air as he saddled his dun-gelding sergeant. The horse had been with him for 12 years, almost as long as Blackwood had worn a badge. Some said the animal could follow a trail better than most men. On this day, Blackwood hoped that was true. The path to Silverton Pass wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily into the high country. Fresh snowmelt gurgled in streams beside the trail, and new green shoots poked through the forest floor. Spring was coming, but up here, winter wasn't quite ready to surrender. Blackwood spotted the first sign of trouble near Widow's Creek. A horse, partially eaten by scavengers, wearing the brand of Walters Ranch. Further up the trail, he found a blood-soaked deputy's badge. Of Deputy Walters or the volunteers, there was no other trace. The sun was high overhead when Blackwood finally crested the rise overlooking Evergreen Meadow, where wagon trains typically made camp before the final push to Silverton Pass. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart cold. The wagons had formed a perfect circle in the clearing, just as pioneer trains had done for decades against Indian attacks. But this was no ordinary raid. Even from a distance, Blackwood could see bodies scattered like broken dolls across the snow-patched ground. He approached cautiously, Sergeant's ears flattened against his head, the horse sensing the wrongness that hung in the air. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was complete, as if nature itself had fled this place of death. The first body Blackwood encountered lay just outside the wagon circle, a man in his 50s, face frozen in a mask of terror, throat torn out with such violence that his head was nearly severed. Nearby was a Winchester rifle, unfired, still clutched in lifeless hands. Inside the circle, the massacre revealed itself in all its horror. 23 people, men, women, and children, slaughtered with savage brutality. Some appeared to have been killed quickly, others showed signs of having been toyed with. Blackwood had seen death in many forms, but never anything like this. "What in God's name happened here?" he whispered, his voice sounding hollow in the silent clearing. He dismounted, tying Sergeant to a wagon wheel. The horse whinnied nervously, rolling his eyes. Blackwood patted his neck. "Easy, boy. I won't be long." The lawman moved methodically among the dead, noting details with clinical detachment. The only way to keep the horror at bay. Jacob Dawson, the wagon master, lay near the center of the circle, a long-barreled Colt still in his hand. 7 empty shell casings surrounded him. Whatever had attacked the train, at least Dawson had gone down fighting. Blackwood recognized several of the victims: the Miller family from Pine Hollow, old Doc Simmons and his wife, the Taylor brothers who'd been saving to buy land near Silverton. Good people, all of them. People who deserved better than this savage end. As he circled the site, a detail nagged at Blackwood's mind. Something was missing. He scanned the ground again, realization dawning slowly. Despite the obvious struggle, despite Dawson's spent ammunition, there were no bodies other than those of the wagon train members. Not a single attacker had fallen. "Impossible," Blackwood muttered. "Even the most skilled raiders would have taken casualties in such close quarters." Then he saw them, the footprints. At first, he thought they belonged to a large bear, but closer inspection proved otherwise. They were elongated, almost human in shape, but larger than any man's foot Blackwood had ever seen, with what appeared to be claw marks at each toe. And they were everywhere, circling the wagons, moving between bodies. Blackwood knelt beside one particularly clear print, pressed into a patch of bloody mud. 5 toes, but longer than normal, with distinct claw impressions. The stride length, judging by the spacing, would belong to something 7 or 8 feet tall. He followed the prints, noting how they converged at the far side of the clearing, before moving off as a group toward the looming shadow of the mountain range to the north. Shadow Mountain, the locals called it, a place steeped in legend and avoided by most sensible folk. 20, maybe 30 individuals, Blackwood estimated, counting the different print sizes. Not Indians, not white bandits. Something else entirely. As Blackwood prepared to leave and report back to Pine Hollow, something caught his eye, a flash of white against the dark soil near one of the wagons. He moved closer, discovering a small leather-bound journal partially hidden beneath a wagon wheel. The name Sarah Collins was inscribed on the cover in delicate handwriting. He recognized the name. Sarah Collins, 19 years old, daughter of the blacksmith from Pine Hollow. She'd been traveling to Silverton to marry her sweetheart, a miner named Daniel Spencer. Blackwood glanced around the clearing, locating her body near one of the wagons. Her face, unlike many others, seemed peaceful, as if death had come quickly at least. Blackwood opened the journal, flipping to the last entry, dated just 2 days prior. April 12th, 1878, we've made camp at Evergreen Meadow. 1 more day's journey to Silverton, to Daniel, to my new life. Mr. Dawson says the path should be clear enough, though we may need to double the teams for the steeper sections. The strangest thing happened tonight. As I was gathering firewood, at the edge of camp, I heard whispers coming from the tree line. Not English, not any language I've ever heard. When I looked, I saw nothing, but I felt watched. Mr. Taylor says I'm just nervous about the wedding, but Mr. Dawson doubled the night watch anyway. There have been stories about Shadow Mountain for years, tales of people gone missing, of hunting, parties that never returned, of miners who ventured too far into the high caves and were never seen again. Old Mrs. Simmons calls them mountain tales to frighten children, but the look in Mr. Dawson's eyes tells a different story. Daniel wrote that the mining company recently blasted a new shaft, deeper than any previous attempts. They found something. In there, he said, not gold, but something else. He promised to show me when I arrived. I wonder if the entry ended abruptly. Whatever Sarah Collins had been about to write remained unfinished, her thoughts silenced forever in this blood-soaked meadow. Blackwood tucked the journal into his coat pocket and returned to Sergeant. The horse was agitated, pawing the ground and tossing his head. "I know, boy," Blackwood murmured. "We're leaving." He mounted, taking one last look at the massacre site. By all rights, he should ride back to Pine Hollow immediately, report what he'd found, and organize a proper burial party. That would be the sensible course of action, but Blackwood's eyes were drawn to those strange footprints leading north toward Shadow Mountain. Whatever had done this was still out there, and if Sarah's journal entry was any indication, it might be connected to the new mining operations near Silverton. "Damn it all," Blackwood muttered, turning Sergeant's head toward the mountain trail, instead of back toward town. He couldn't leave this mystery unsolved, not with the brutal deaths of 23 people demanding justice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The trail grew steeper as Blackwood followed the footprints up the mountain. Old mining paths crisscrossed the slopes, remnants of the silver rush that had brought the first settlers to this region. Most of those mines had played out years ago, but the Spencer Mining Company had recently reopened several shafts, claiming to have found new veins deeper in the mountain. As the afternoon wore on, heavy clouds gathered overhead, threatening snow. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, musky odor that made Sergeant snort and shy. Blackwood patted the horse's neck reassuringly, though he himself felt increasingly uneasy. The footprints remained clear despite the rocky terrain, as if whatever made them wanted to be followed. They led to a narrow game trail that switchbacked up a particularly steep section of the mountain. "Easy, Sergeant," Blackwood murmured, as the horse picked his way carefully along the treacherous path. One misstep would send them both plummeting hundreds of feet to the jagged rocks below. As they rounded a bend, Blackwood spotted something ahead, a dark opening in the mountainside. Not a natural cave, but a mine entrance, shored up with thick timber supports. The footprints led directly inside. Blackwood dismounted, tying Sergeant to a stunted pine. "Stay here, boy," he said, checking his colt before approaching the mine entrance. A weathered sign hung askew above the opening. "Spencer Silver, shaft number 7. This must be the new shaft Daniel had mentioned in his letter to Sarah. The darkness beyond the entrance seemed absolute. Swallowing the fading daylight, Blackwood fished a small lantern from his saddlebag, lit it, and drew his revolver. The strange odor was stronger here, an alien smell that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He hesitated at the threshold, an uncharacteristic fear gripping him. In 17 years of law enforcement, Ethan Blackwood had faced down the worst mankind had to offer: murderers, thieves, and madmen. But something about this place, about those footprints, stirred a primal dread in his soul. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered. 23 people were dead. If whatever killed them was hiding in this mine, Blackwood needed to know. With the lantern held high in his left hand and his Colt steady in his right, Marshal Ethan Blackwood stepped into the darkness of Spencer Silver Shaft number 7, unaware that he was being watched by multiple pairs of gleaming eyes from the shadows above the entrance. The first thing that struck Blackwood was the unexpected warmth of the tunnel. Most mines were cool year-round, especially this high in the mountains. But the air here felt almost feverish against his skin, carrying that same musky scent he'd detected outside, only stronger now, mixed with the metallic tang of freshly exposed rock and something else, something copper-sweet that he recognized all too well from battlefields and crime scenes. Blood. The main shaft ran straight into the mountain, supported every few yards by sturdy timber frames. The walls glistened with moisture, reflecting his lantern light and creating the disorienting impression that the stone itself was alive, pulsing with an inner light. Blackwood moved cautiously, noting that the strange footprints continued along the shaft floor, perfectly preserved in the damp soil. They were joined now by bootprints, miners' boots, judging by the distinctive pattern left by hobnails. The two sets of tracks overlapped, some of the bootprints on top of the strange tracks, others underneath, suggesting the creatures and the miners had used this tunnel multiple times. About 50 yards in, the main shaft intersected with a newer tunnel branching off to the right. The fresh-cut timber supports and recently blasted rock walls indicated this was the new section Daniel had mentioned in his letter to Sarah. The strange footprints led that way. Blackwood paused, listening intently. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water and his own measured breathing. He could turn back now, ride to Silverton, gather a posse. That would be the prudent choice. But 23 people were dead, and whatever killed them might still be. In these tunnels, if it escaped while Blackwood went for help, more people could die. He couldn't take that risk. With grim resolve, he turned into the new tunnel, following the tracks. This passage sloped downward at a steep angle, forcing Blackwood to brace himself against the slick walls. The air grew warmer, the strange smell stronger, until it seemed to coat the inside of his nose and throat. His lantern light revealed more bootprints, but something about them was wrong. They no longer moved in orderly patterns, but scattered chaotically as if the miners had been running away from something. The tunnel abruptly widened into a large chamber, and Blackwood's lantern illuminated a scene from the nightmare. The mining equipment, picks, shovels, drills, lay scattered across the cavern floor. A dynamite cart had been overturned, its contents spilled, and there was blood, so much blood, splashed across the walls and pooled on the ground, but no bodies. Just like at the wagon train, whoever or whatever had attacked here had taken the bodies. With them, Blackwood swept his lantern around the chamber, noticing a crude wooden table against one wall. Papers were spread across it, maps, geological surveys, and what appeared to be a journal. He moved closer, keeping his back to the wall and his revolver ready. The journal belonged to Daniel Spencer himself. Blackwood flipped it open, finding the last entry, dated just 1 week earlier, April 6, 1878. We've broken through to a new cavern system, unlike anything I've ever seen. The formations aren't natural. Some of the tunnels appear to have been carved, with strange symbols etched into the walls. Jenkins thinks we've discovered an ancient Indian holy site, but these markings don't match any tribal patterns I've ever encountered. The men are uneasy. 2 claim to have heard whispering coming from the deeper chambers. Rodriguez swears he saw something moving in the darkness beyond our lamps. Something big. I told them it was just nerves, the air pressure. I'm playing tricks on them, but I've heard it too, the whispers. They're getting louder each day. We found a chamber filled with, I hardly know how to describe them, objects, artifacts, made from some kind of metal I've never seen before. One piece, shaped almost like a mask, seems to glow in the darkness. Jenkins touched it and hasn't been the same since. Keeps talking about the ones who sleep beneath. I've secured the artifact in the strongbox until the university expert arrives next month. I haven't told the men, but I've seen them too. Glimpses of tall figures watching us from the shadows. I tell myself, It's just my imagination, the poor air quality affecting my mind. But deep down, I know better. Sarah arrives next week. I should shut down operations until we understand what we're dealing with, but we're so close to a major discovery. One that could make us all rich beyond imagining. Just a few more days. Blackwood closed the journal, a chill running down his spine despite the oppressive heat of the chamber. He examined the maps on the table, noting that Daniel had carefully charted the newly discovered tunnel system extending deep beneath Shadow Mountain. According to the map, the cavern he was standing in connected to a natural cave system through a narrow passage in the far corner. That passage was where the strange footprints led. Blackwood raised his lantern, illuminating the dark opening across the chamber. Even from this distance, he could tell it was different from the man-made tunnels. An irregular arch disappearing into blackness, its edges smooth as if worn by water over millennia, or by the passage of something large over and over again. As he stared at the opening, a noise emerged from its depths, a soft, rhythmic sound somewhere between breathing and whispering. Words that were not words, in a language never meant for human tongues. Every instinct screamed at Blackwood to retreat, to flee back to daylight and safety. But the memory of those slaughtered families drove him forward. Step by cautious step, he approached the natural passage, his revolver aimed. Into the darkness, the tunnel beyond was larger than it had appeared from a distance, its ceiling high enough that Blackwood could stand upright. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered with the strange symbols Daniel had mentioned, curves and angles that hurt the eyes to follow, patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The footprints were clearer here, pressed into a layer of fine sand covering the tunnel floor, multiple sets leading deeper into the mountain, and among them drag marks, as if heavy objects had been pulled along. Bodies, Blackwood realized with grim certainty. The tunnel curved gently downward, the air growing increasingly hot and thick with that alien scent. Blackwood's lantern light seemed to dim, struggling against a darkness that felt almost alive, hungry. He'd been walking for perhaps 10 minutes, when the tunnel abruptly opened into an immense cavern. Blackwood stopped at the threshold, his mind struggling to comprehend what lay before him. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness above, but it wasn't the size that robbed Blackwood of breath. It was what filled it. Structures rose from the cavern floor, buildings of a sort, but not made by human hands. Their architecture followed rules that made no sense to human eyes. Angles that seemed to bend in impossible ways, surfaces that appeared both solid and fluid simultaneously. They were constructed of a material that resembled metal, but glowed, with an inner light, casting the entire cavern in a sickly greenish illumination. And moving among these alien structures were the creatures. They were tall, 8 feet or more, with elongated limbs that bent at odd angles. Their bodies seemed almost skeletal, covered in a pale, translucent skin through which Blackwood could see organs that pulsed and shifted in patterns no human anatomy could explain. Their heads were bulbous, with no visible eyes, but multiple, vertical slits where a face should be. They moved with a liquid grace that belied their size, communicating with those same whispered sounds Blackwood had heard earlier. Some carried objects that might have been tools or weapons, constructed of the same strange metal as the structures, but it was what lay at the center of the cavern that froze the blood in Blackwood's veins. A raised platform upon which were arranged the bodies from the wagon train and presumably the missing miners. The creatures were moving among them, using their tools to harvest them. There was no other word for the methodical way they were. Extracting organs, collecting fluids, examining tissues. Near the platform stood what appeared to be a leader, taller than the others, adorned with what looked like ceremonial markings across its pale skin. It directed the others with gestures of its elongated fingers, occasionally emitting louder vocalizations that sent the workers scurrying to new tasks. Blackwood stood transfixed, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Such things couldn't exist beneath the mountains of Colorado. Yet the evidence was before his eyes, an alien civilization hidden beneath Shadow Mountain, preying on humans who ventured too close to their domain. His hand tightened on his revolver. 6 bullets against dozens of these creatures. It would be suicide. His duty now was to escape, to warn others about what lurked beneath the mountain. Slowly, carefully, Blackwood began to back away from the chamber entrance. 1 step, 2, 3. His boot dislodged a small stone, sending it skittering across the tunnel floor. The noise seemed deafening in the hushed cavern. As one, the creatures stopped their activities. The leader turned toward the tunnel entrance, the vertical slits in its face opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth and orbs that might have been eyes. Eyes that fixed directly on Blackwood's position. It made a sound then, not a whisper, but a high, piercing shriek that echoed through the cavern. The others responded immediately, dropping their tools and surging toward the tunnel. Blackwood turned and ran, his lantern swinging wildly, casting frantic shadows on the tunnel walls. Behind him, he could hear the creatures entering the passage, their strange footfalls oddly light for beings of such size. They moved fast, too fast. The tunnel seemed longer on the return journey, twisted somehow, as if the mountain itself was conspiring to trap him. Blackwood's lungs burned, his legs ached, but terror drove him onward. The mining chamber appeared ahead, a brief moment of familiar territory before the final sprint to the surface. As he burst into the chamber, a shape detached itself from the shadows near the table, one of the creatures somehow ahead of him. It lunged with frightening speed, long fingers reaching for Blackwood's throat. He fired twice, the revolver shots thunderous in the confined space. The creature staggered backward, a strange, luminous fluid leaking from 2 holes in its chest. It shrieked a sound of pain and rage that sent shivers down Blackwood's spine. He didn't wait to see if it would fall. 4 bullets left, and many more creatures behind him. He ran for the main shaft, hearing the pursuing horde growing closer. The slope that had been so difficult to descend now worked in his favor, lending speed to his desperate flight. The main shaft stretched before him, the distant square of daylight at its end like a beacon of salvation. Blackwood ran as he'd never run before. The creature's alien shrieks echoing off the walls around him. They were gaining, he could feel it, could smell their strange odor growing stronger. 50 yards to the entrance, 40, 30. Something snagged his coat from behind. Long fingers tearing at the fabric, trying to pull him back into darkness. Blackwood twisted, firing blindly over his shoulder. A shriek told him he'd hit something, and the pressure on his coat released. 20 yards. 10. He burst from the mine entrance into the fading evening light, nearly colliding with Sergeant. The horse reared in panic, sensing the creatures close behind. Blackwood holstered his revolver and vaulted into the saddle in one fluid motion, born of years of practice and now desperation. "Go, boy, go!" he shouted, digging his heels into the horse's flanks. Sergeant needed no encouragement. The dun gelding leapt forward onto the narrow trail, sure-footed even in his terror. Behind them, the first of the creatures emerged from the mine entrance, shrieking into the mountain air. Blackwood didn't look back, focusing instead on the treacherous trail ahead. One wrong step could send them plummeting to their deaths, a fate perhaps preferable to what awaited if the creatures caught them. As they rounded the first switchback, Blackwood reached into his saddlebag, his fingers closing around a stick of dynamite he carried for emergencies. Striker matches were in his vest pocket. It was risky, lighting dynamite on a moving horse, but he had no choice. The fuse sputtered to life. Blackwood counted to 3, then hurled the dynamite back toward the trail above. The explosion came seconds later, a satisfying boom followed by the sound of falling rock. A quick glance confirmed his success. The trail was blocked by a small avalanche of stone and dirt, but through the settling dust he saw them. The creatures, scaling the cliffside with inhuman agility, bypassing the blocked trail entirely. Impossible. Blackwood breathed. He turned forward again, urging the sergeant to greater speed. The horse responded valiantly, foam flecking his mouth as he galloped down the mountain trail. By Blackwood's estimation, they were 4 hours from Silverton, the closest settlement, 4 hours with those things in pursuit. As darkness fell across Shadow Mountain, Marshal Ethan Blackwood fled toward civilization, carrying with him a warning of horrors beyond human understanding. Behind him, inhuman shapes moved through the gathering night, their whispered communications carried on the cold mountain wind. The creatures from beneath Shadow Mountain had remained hidden for centuries. Now their secret was known, and they would not rest until silence was restored. The journey down Shadow Mountain was a nightmare of steep trails and frequent glances over his shoulder. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent Marshal Blackwood's hand to his revolver. Sergeant seemed to share his anxiety, ears constantly twitching backward, muscles tense beneath the saddle. Blackwood had lost sight of the pursuing creatures an hour back, but that offered little comfort. Their unnatural climbing abilities and speed suggested they could be anywhere, perhaps even ahead, lying in wait. The moon rose, casting the forest in ghostly silver light. Blackwood kept off the main trail, cutting cross-country through dense stands of pine and aspen. Better to take the difficult route than the predictable one. By midnight, the distant lights of Silverton appeared in the valley below, a constellation of lanterns and hearth fires that had never looked so inviting. Blackwood allowed himself a moment of hope. If he could reach the mining town, warn the people. As Sergeant picked his way down the final slope, Blackwood rehearsed what he would say to the town sheriff. The truth sounds insane, even to his own ears. Underground creatures, alien structures, human harvesting. Who would believe such a tale? The main street of Silverton was largely deserted when Blackwood rode in, just a few miners staggering between saloons and a pair of prostitutes calling from a balcony. The horses' hooves echoed loudly on the packed dirt, drawing curious glances. Blackwood dismounted before the sheriff's office, his legs nearly buckling from exhaustion. He hadn't realized until that moment how completely drained he was. The night deputy, a young man named Carson, met him at the door. "Marshal Blackwood, what brings you to—" Carson's eyes widened as he took in Blackwood's appearance. The torn coat, the dirt and blood, the wild look in his eyes. "Jesus, what happened to you? Where's Sheriff Harmon?" Blackwood demanded, pushing past him into the office. "Home, I expect. It's near 1 in the morning. Get him, now, and Mayor Fletcher, and anyone else with authority in this town." Carson hesitated. "Sir, maybe you should rest first. You look— There's no time." Blackwood slammed his fist on the desk, making the young deputy jump. "People are going to die, boy, more than I already have. Now move." Within 30 minutes, a bleary-eyed gathering had assembled in the sheriff's office. Sheriff Wade Harmon, a barrel-chested man with a walrus mustache, Mayor Joseph Fletcher, still in, his nightshirt beneath a hastily donned coat, Dr. Lewis Graham, the town physician, and Stanley Warner, the portly owner of the Spencer Mining Company. Blackwood told his story as plainly as he could, omitting nothing, from the massacre at the wagon train to the horrors beneath the mountain. As he spoke, disbelief gave way to concern, then to open skepticism. "Let me get this straight," Warner interrupted, his jowls quivering with indignation. "You're suggesting my mine, my very profitable mine, has uncovered some sort of, monster nest?" "I'm telling you what I saw," Blackwood replied evenly. 23 people from that wagon train are dead. Your miners are dead too, Warner." "Preposterous. I'd have heard if my men were killed." When did you last have contact with the Shaft 7 crew? Warner's face reddened. 3 days ago, but that's not unusual. They're deep in a new seam, working round the clock. They're not working, Blackwood said quietly. They're dead or worse, and whatever killed them is coming here next. Sheriff Harmon stroked his mustache thoughtfully. We've had strange reports these past few months. Hunters gone missing. Odd noises in the high country at night. Some of the Ute trackers refuse to go near Shadow Mountain altogether now. Indian superstition, Warner scoffed. Maybe, Harmon conceded, but Marshal Blackwood isn't given to tales or hysteria. If he says he saw something, what he describes is impossible, Mayor Fletcher cut in. Some new tribe, perhaps, or bears, but underground creatures harvesting human organs. It's absurd. Dr. Graham, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Actually, there might be another explanation. All eyes turned to the physician. Marshal, you've been through a traumatic experience. You found a massacre site, followed a dangerous trail alone, and were in that mine for hours, breathing God knows what kinds of gases and mineral dust. Mining fumes can cause hallucinations, paranoia. I know what I saw, Blackwood growled. I'm sure you believe that, Graham said soothingly. But the mind plays tricks when under extreme stress and exposure to toxic elements. Blackwood pulled Daniel Spencer's journal from his coat. Read this. The mine owner saw them too before he disappeared. Warner snatched the journal before Graham could take it. This is company property, he said, stuffing it into his pocket without so much as glancing at it. And I won't have these wild stories threatening my operation or causing a panic in town. People need to be warned, Blackwood insisted. What they need is to keep working without fear of imaginary monsters, Warner retorted. Mayor, surely you see the economic damage such rumors could cause. Fletcher nodded. Silverton depends on those mines, Marshal. We can't have workers fleeing. Based on unverified claims. Blackwood looked to Harmon, hoping for support, but the sheriff's expression had grown guarded. We'll investigate, of course, Harmon said carefully. I'll send deputies to check on the mine tomorrow, and to verify your report about the wagon train. Tomorrow will be too late, Blackwood said. Those things could reach town by dawn. Then we'll post extra guards tonight, Harmon replied, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. Deputy Carson escorted Marshal Blackwood to the hotel. See that he gets a hot meal and a room. He turned back to Blackwood. Get some rest, Marshal. Things will look clearer in the morning. The dismissal was obvious. These men, these fools, weren't going to act, not in time. Blackwood allowed Carson to lead him to the Silver Peak Hotel, his mind racing. He couldn't force the town officials to believe him, but he couldn't simply wait for slaughter either. There had to be another way. At the hotel he ordered food he didn't taste, and coffee he drank in desperate gulps. The young deputy hovered nearby, clearly under orders not to leave Blackwood alone, whether for the marshal's protection or to keep him from spreading panic was unclear. Carson, Blackwood said suddenly, you grew up around here, didn't you? The deputy nodded. Born and raised, sir. Ever hear stories about Shadow Mountain? Strange disappearances? Unexplained phenomena? Carson shifted uncomfortably. Just old tales. My grandfather used to say the mountain was hollow, filled with beings from before mankind walked the earth. Said they took people sometimes, for purposes we couldn't understand. And what did you think of these stories? Thought they were just that stories, to keep children from wandering too far. Carson hesitated. But my cousin Jeremiah went hunting up there 3 winters back, never returned. Search parties found nothing, not even tracks. Blackwood leaned forward. I need your help, Carson. The sheriff, the mayor. They won't act. Not until it's too late. What can I do? I'm just a deputy. You can help me warn people. Get as many out of town as possible before dawn. Carson paled. That would cost me my job. Maybe get me thrown in jail for causing panic. Better unemployed than dead. The young man stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. Let me think about it. It wasn't the response Blackwood had hoped for, but it was better than outright refusal. "I'm going to try to rest," he said, rising from the table. "Wake me at first light." In his hotel room, Blackwood cleaned his revolver, counting his remaining ammunition. 4 bullets. He had more in his saddlebags, assuming Sargent hadn't been stolen from the livery where Carson had taken him. Sleep was impossible. Every time Blackwood closed his eyes, he saw those creatures moving among the bodies of the wagon train victims, harvesting organs with clinical precision. Instead, he sat by the window watching the quiet street below, wondering if inhuman shapes were already infiltrating the town's shadows. Dawn was still hours away when a soft knock came at his door. Blackwood opened it, revolver ready, to find Deputy Carson. "You were right," the young man whispered, face ashen. "They're here." "Where?" "The mine office. I was making my rounds and saw lights inside. Thought it might be looters, but through the window." Carson swallowed hard. "Those things you described, 3 of them. They killed the night watchman. Opened him up right. On Warner's desk." Blackwood's blood ran cold. "Did they see you?" "Don't think so. I ran straight here. Go wake Sheriff Harmon. Then start quietly evacuating the west side of town. That's farthest from the mine office. Tell people to take only what they can carry and head for Franklin Pass." "What about you?" Blackwood checked his revolver. "I'm going to buy you time." "That's suicide." "Probably," Blackwood agreed. "But it's our only chance. Now go." The streets were still dark as Blackwood made his way toward the Spencer Mining Company office, a 2-story brick building at the east end of town. No lights showed from within now, but that meant nothing. Those creatures seemed to see perfectly well in the darkness. He approached cautiously, using the shadows of storefronts for cover. The night watchman lay sprawled on the office steps, his chest cavity yawning open, empty of organs. The sight confirmed Carson's account and steeled Blackwood's resolve. These things had to be stopped, whatever the cost. The office door stood ajar. Blackwood slipped inside, his eyes adjusting to the deeper darkness. The front room appeared empty, but papers were strewn across the floor, filing cabinets tipped over. The creatures had been searching for something. A soft whisper drifted from the back office, Warner's private domain. Blackwood inched closer, keeping his revolver trained on the partially open door. Through the gap, he could make out 3 of the pale creatures, huddled over Warner's massive oak desk. They were examining what appeared to be maps, the same mining surveys Blackwood had seen in Daniel Spencer's journal. One of the creatures made a series of clicking sounds, pointing at a specific location on the map. The others responded with those same unsettling whispers. Whatever they were planning, Blackwood knew it couldn't be good for the people of Silverton. He considered his options. 4 bullets against 3 creatures. He might take them all down if he was very lucky, but the gunshots would alert any others in town, and based on what he'd seen in the cavern, there could be dozens more. As he debated his next move, the floorboard beneath his foot creaked, a small sound, but enough. The creatures froze, their bulbous heads swiveling toward the door in perfect unison. Blackwood didn't hesitate. He kicked the door fully open and fired twice in rapid succession, aiming for the closest creature's head. The first shot went wide, splintering the wall. The second found its mark, causing the creature to emit that same piercing shriek he'd heard in the mine. The other 2 moved with shocking speed, one leaping over the desk while the other flipped a heavy filing cabinet toward Blackwood. He barely dodged the improvised missile, losing precious seconds. By the time he recovered his stance, the wounded creature had fled through a back window, and the remaining 2 were converging on him from different angles. Blackwood fired again, catching one in what might have been a shoulder. It staggered, but didn't fall. 3 shots expended, 1 bullet left. The odds were worsening by the second. The uninjured creature lunged, its elongated arms reaching for Blackwood with clawed fingers. He ducked under the attack and slammed the butt of his revolver into what he hoped was a vulnerable area on its torso. The creature emitted a high-pitched whistle, but seemed largely unaffected. Blackwood backpedaled, trying to reach the door, but the wounded creature cut off his retreat. He was trapped between them, one bullet remaining, and no clear path to escape. A window. It was his only chance. Blackwood fired his last round at the closest creature, turned, and hurled himself through the glass pane to his right. The crash and pain were simultaneous, shards slicing his arms and face as he tumbled onto the dirt alley behind the office. He rolled to his feet, ignoring the warm blood trickling down his cheek. The creatures would be right behind him. He had to reach Sergeant, get out of town, and circle back to help with the evacuation. As he sprinted toward the livery stable, shouts and screams erupted from different parts of town. The attack had begun. Carson must not have had enough time to evacuate many people. Or perhaps there were more creatures than Blackwood had estimated, already spread throughout Silverton. The livery was dark and quiet when he arrived. Too quiet. No whinnies or shuffling from the stalls. Blackwood grabbed a lantern hanging by the door and struck a match, raising the light to reveal a scene of carnage. The stable hands lay butchered among the straw. The horses were gone, either escaped or taken, including Sergeant. Damn it, Blackwood muttered. Without a horse, his options narrowed considerably. He couldn't outrun these creatures on foot. More screams echoed from the direction of the hotel, followed by several gunshots. The town was waking to terror. Blackwood searched the stablemaster's office, finding a loaded shotgun and a box of shells. Better than his empty revolver, at least. He pocketed as many shells as he could and moved to the stable doors, peering out at the street. Chaos had descended on Silverton. People ran in every direction, some still in nightclothes. Several buildings were burning, the flames casting a hellish glow over the scene. And moving among the panicked humans were the creatures, at least a dozen, that Blackwood could see, methodically cutting down anyone in their path. He had to find Carson, help coordinate whatever resistance might be possible. The sheriff's office was 3 buildings down. Blackwood took a deep breath and stepped into the madness. He'd gone perhaps 20 yards when a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Mayor Fletcher stumbling toward him, his nightshirt soaked with blood. "You were right," Fletcher gasped, clutching at Blackwood's arm. "God forgive me, you were right. Those things, they're everywhere." Warner went to confront them at the mine office. They tore him apart right in front of me. "Where's Sheriff Harmon?" Blackwood asked, supporting the wounded mayor. "Dead. They attacked the jail first. Carson's organizing defense at the church. Women and children inside, men forming a perimeter." Fletcher coughed, blood speckling his lips. "I'm hit badly, Marshal. Internal. Don't waste time on me. I'll get you to the doctor." "No. Listen." Fletcher gripped Blackwood's shirt with surprising strength. "There's a Ute elder who used to come to town. Mountain Shadow, he called himself. Lives in a cabin up Elk Creek. He spoke of these things once and said his people had been fighting them for generations. Said they fear fire and sunlight." "Sunlight's still hours away," Blackwood noted. "But fire we can manage." Fletcher nodded weakly. The mining warehouse, dynamite, blasting oil, enough to level half the mountain. His grip loosened. "Make them pay, Marshal, for all of us." The mayor's eyes glazed over, his final breath rattling in his chest. Blackwood gently lowered him to the ground, processing this new information. The creatures feared fire, and he knew where to find plenty of it. The mining warehouse stood at the far end of town, near the railroad spur. If Blackwood could reach it, rig the explosives somehow. But first, he needed to help the survivors at the church. Moving from shadow to shadow, Blackwood made his way toward St. Mary's, the small clapboard church that served as Silverton's only house of worship. As he neared it, he could see Carson had organized the defense well. About 20 men formed a perimeter around the building, armed with everything from shotguns to pickaxes. Lanterns blazed from every window, creating a barrier of light. Blackwood approached the barricade, identifying himself before he came too close. "Carson, it's Marshal Blackwood." The young deputy's face appeared, haggard but determined. "Marshal, thought you might be dead. Not yet. You've done well here." Carson shook his head. "Not well enough. We've lost half the town already. These things, they're picking us off street by street. We can't hold it until dawn." "We might not have to." Blackwood explained Fletcher's information about the creature's fear of fire and his plan for the warehouse explosives. "That's a suicide mission," Carson objected. "That warehouse is on the far side of town, through the thick of them. I'll go through the alleys, stay out of sight. Then what? Even if you reach it, how do you plan to deploy explosives across town?" It was a good question, one Blackwood hadn't fully answered for himself. "There's a handcar on the rail spur. I could load it with dynamite, light the fuses, and send it toward the center of their activity." Carson considered this. Might work, but someone would need to ride it part way, make sure it stays on track until the last moment. "That would be me." The young deputy studied Blackwood's face. "You really are ready to die for this town, aren't you? A town that didn't even believe you." "I'm ready to die to stop those things," Blackwood corrected. "Before they can reach the next town and the next." Carson nodded slowly. "Then you shouldn't go alone. I'll come with you. You're needed here. These people trust you. Trent can take over. He was a sergeant in the army." Carson gestured to a grizzled man organizing the western perimeter. "Besides, it'll take two to operate that handcar effectively." Blackwood couldn't argue with the logic, though he hated involving the young man in what could well be a fatal mission. "All right, let's move now, while we still can." After briefing Trent and gathering additional ammunition, Blackwood and Carson slipped away from the church's relative safety. The town was burning in several places now, the worst of the fire centered around the hotel and saloon district. The screams had largely stopped, not a good sign. They moved in tandem, covering each other as they navigated the labyrinth of alleys and backlots. Twice they were forced to hide as groups of creatures moved past, carrying struggling humans, or limp bodies. "They're taking some alive," Carson whispered after the second encounter. "Why?" "Nothing good," Blackwood replied grimly. "All the more reason to finish this now." The warehouse loomed before them, a large wooden structure secured with heavy padlocks. No lights showed from within, but that didn't mean it was empty. "Cover me," Blackwood said, moving toward the side door with a set of skeleton keys he'd taken from the dead sheriff's office. Carson knelt at the corner of the building, shotgun ready. The third key worked. The lock clicked open, and Blackwood eased the door ajar, wincing at the slight creak of hinges. The warehouse interior was pitch black. He struck a match, lighting a small lantern they'd brought from the church. The space was cavernous, filled with mining equipment, timber supports, and, most importantly, crates labeled "Danger Explosives." Against the far wall sat barrels of blasting oil, used for the most difficult mining operations. It was enough firepower to level half of Silverton. "We're in luck," Blackwood whispered as Carson joined him. "Start gathering dynamite. I'll check the rail spur for the handcar." Narrow-gauge rail line ran directly to the warehouse loading bay for transporting equipment and ore. Blackwood slid open the large bay doors, revealing the spur line and, as he'd hoped, a maintenance handcar sitting on the tracks. "Carson, we've got our transport," he called softly. As the words left his mouth, a familiar whisper echoed from the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. Blackwood raised his lantern, the light revealing 5 of the creatures emerging from behind stacks of crates. They must have been lying in wait, perhaps guarding the very weapons Blackwood hoped to use against them. "Get down," he shouted, firing the shotgun one-handed while still holding the lantern. The blast caught the lead creature in the chest, driving it backward into its companions. Carson appeared at his side, his own shotgun roaring. 2 more creatures fell, their strange, luminous blood spattering the warehouse floor. "The handcar," Blackwood ordered. "Get it loaded. I'll hold them off." The young deputy hesitated only a moment before darting toward the crates of dynamite. Blackwood maintained a steady fire, forcing the remaining creatures to take cover behind. Mining equipment. One creature, bolder than the others, leapt atop a stack of crates, preparing to pounce. Blackwood tracked it with his shotgun, but the hammer fell on an empty chamber. Out of shells. He dropped the useless weapon and drew his hunting knife, a poor defense against these beings, but all he had left. The creature seemed to recognize his vulnerability, emitting what sounded almost like a laugh before launching itself toward him. A thunderous boom filled the warehouse. The creature's head exploded in a spray of luminous matter, its body crashing to the floor, mere feet from Blackwood. He turned to see Carson standing by the handcar, revolver smoking in his hand. "Nice shot," Blackwood acknowledged. "Last bullet," Carson replied. "Car's loaded. We need to move." The handcar was indeed loaded, perhaps too well. Carson had placed at least 20 dynamite sticks on it, along with a small barrel of blasting oil. The fuses were all connected in a rudimentary but effective arrangement. Blackwood glanced back at the remaining creatures, which were regrouping for another attack. "Light it up, let's go." They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the handcar's pump handle. Carson struck a match, lighting the master fuse, which would need at least 2 minutes to reach the dynamite. Then they began pumping, driving the car forward onto the main track that ran through the center of Silverton. Behind them, the creatures burst from the warehouse, shrieking in what might have been fury or alarm. They gave chase immediately, moving with that unsettling speed Blackwood had witnessed on Shadow Mountain. "Faster," he urged, his arms burning with the effort of pumping the heavy car. The handcar picked up speed, rattling along the tracks toward the heart of town. The burning buildings illuminated their path, casting long shadows across the rails. Ahead, more creatures appeared, drawn by the commotion or perhaps sensing their plan. "They're cutting us off!" Carson shouted over the noise of the handcar. Blackwood checked the fuse, about 1 minute remaining. "We need to get closer to the center of town. Maximum effect." "We'll never make it past that group ahead." Blackwood made a split-second decision. "Jump off at the next alley. Get back to the church." "What about you?" "I'll take it a bit further, then follow." Carson's expression said he didn't believe that for a second, but he nodded. As they approached the alley beside the assayer's office, he prepared to jump. "It's been an honor, Marshal." "Likewise, Deputy." Carson leapt from the still-moving handcar, rolling roughly across the dirt before disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Blackwood continued pumping, driving the explosive-laden car toward the largest concentration of creatures near the town square. The fuse burned lower. 30 seconds, maybe less. The handcar was moving at a good clip now, enough to coast the remaining distance. Blackwood prepared to jump, eyeing a narrow gap between buildings. Before he could make his move, something slammed into him from behind, one of the creatures having somehow leapt onto the moving car. Its clawed hands wrapped around Blackwood's throat, cutting off his air. He struggled, trying to break free, but the creature's strength was inhuman. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. In desperation, he reached for the burning fuse, somehow managing to grasp it. With the last of his strength, he jammed the sparking end into what he hoped was the creature's eye. A piercing shriek split the night. The pressure on his throat vanished as the creature reeled backward, falling from the handcar. Blackwood gasped for air, his lungs burning. The fuse! In the struggle, he'd pulled it free from the dynamite. The explosives would never detonate now, unless... Blackwood looked ahead. The handcar was approaching the town square, where at least 20 of the creatures were gathered around what appeared to be a pile of human bodies. The master fuse was gone, but he still had matches. Time slowed as Marshal Ethan Blackwood made his final decision. He could jump now, might even survive. Or he could ride the handcar into the heart of the enemy, striking a blow that might save countless lives. It was no decision at all, really. He struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with his hand as the handcar rattled toward its destination. When he was certain he couldn't miss, Blackwood touched the match to the exposed dynamite and whispered a quiet prayer. The explosion tore through the night, a sphere of fire that consumed the town square and everything in it. The shockwave flattened buildings for 100 yards in all directions. From the church on the hill, the survivors watched in awe and horror as a miniature sun bloomed in the center of their town, incinerating the creatures that had brought so much death. As the flames reached toward the heavens, Deputy Carson removed his hat, holding it over his heart. "Godspeed, Marshal," he murmured. "Godspeed." Dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of Silverton. The survivors emerged cautiously from the church, surveying the devastation. Of the creatures, there was no sign. Those not caught in the explosion had fled back toward Shadow Mountain as the first rays of sunlight touched the valley. For now, at least, the nightmare has ended. But as Carson stood among the ruins, watching the sun rise over Shadow Mountain, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely a reprieve, not a victory. Somewhere beneath that mountain, in tunnels that reached deeper than any mine, the creatures were regrouping, planning, waiting. He touched the marshal's badge now pinned to his own chest, recovered from Blackwood's belongings at the church and bestowed upon him by the survivors' unanimous vote. It felt heavy, a burden as much as an honor. "I'll be ready," he promised the mountain silhouette. "When you come again, I'll be ready." 3 months after the Silverton massacre, the town was slowly rebuilding. New structures rose from blackened foundations, and fresh-cut timber replaced charred beams. The population had dwindled to less than half its former size. Many survivors had fled to Denver or beyond, unwilling to live in the shadow of the mountain and its secrets. Those who remained spoke of Marshal Blackwood in hushed, reverent tones. A crude memorial stood in what had once been the town square, marking the spot where he had made his final stand. Fresh flowers appeared there each morning, though no one ever admitted to placing them. Acting Sheriff James Carson, the promotion had become official 2 weeks after the attack, stood on the newly constructed porch of the sheriff's office, watching workers rebuild the assayers building across the street. At 26, he was young for such responsibility, but tragedy had a way of accelerating maturity. The silver badge pinned to his chest still felt like it belonged to someone else. "Sheriff?" Carson turned to find Lucy Simmons approaching, a leather satchel clutched in her hands. The young woman had lost her father in the attack, but had stayed to run his dry goods store. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes carrying the haunted look shared by all Silverton survivors. "Miss Simmons, what can I do for you?" "I found something while sorting through Pa's old correspondence." She reached into the satchel, withdrawing a faded envelope. "It's a letter from a professor at Denver University, dated nearly a year ago." Carson accepted the envelope, noting that it had already been opened. "You've read it?" Lucy nodded. "It mentions Shadow Mountain and things living beneath it." Carson's pulse quickened. He ushered Lucy inside the office, closing the door behind them. The letter was written in a precise academic hand, the signature reading, "Professor Edward Holloway, Department of Anthropology. Dear Mr. Simmons, thank you for sharing the artifacts discovered by the Spencer Mining Company. I must confess I have never encountered materials quite like these, and my preliminary tests have yielded puzzling results. The metal composite does not match any known element in our periodic table, and the symbols etched into the surface bear no resemblance to any human language, ancient or modern. Most intriguing are the references in your letter to local legends regarding Shadow Mountain. These align with fragmentary accounts I have collected from various Native American tribes throughout the region. The Utes speak of those who dwell below, entities that have reportedly abducted tribal members for generations. The Navajo have similar tales of the Hollow Mountain people. Most interesting, perhaps, are the Hopi accounts of star beings who arrived before recorded history and made their home beneath the earth. I would very much like to visit your town to examine the mine where these artifacts were discovered. If, as you suggest, there might be an undiscovered civilization dwelling beneath Shadow Mountain, It could represent the most significant anthropological find of the century. I have taken the liberty of sharing your letter, though not the artifacts themselves, with my colleague Dr. Margaret Walsh at the Smithsonian. She has extensive experience with pre-Columbian civilizations and may offer insights I lack. I expect to hear from her within the month. In the meantime, I would advise discretion. Such discoveries often attract unwanted attention from sensationalist press and opportunistic treasure hunters. I plan to travel to Silverton by month's end, pending university approval for the expedition. With great anticipation, Professor Edward Holloway Carson read the letter twice, his unease growing. Did Professor Holloway ever come to Silverton? Lucy shook her head. Not that I know of, but never mentioned him. What about these artifacts? Did your father have them? I haven't found anything unusual in his belongings. She hesitated. But there's something else. A reply from Dr. Walsh was with the letter. She handed him a second sheet of paper. This letter was shorter, the handwriting more hurried. Edward, I implore you to exercise extreme caution regarding the Silverton materials. The symbols you sketched bear disturbing similarities to markings found at 3 other sites across North America, all associated with mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Most notably, an 1847 military expedition to coastal Oregon vanished after reporting the discovery of non-human structures bearing identical markings. The sole survivor, found wandering in a state of severe mental distress, spoke of harvesters emerging from underground chambers. I have forwarded your sketches to Colonel James Bradford at the War Department. This may require governmental intervention. Do not proceed to Silverton until we have conferred further. Margaret Carson set the letters down, his mouth dry. When were these written? Last August, according to the dates, 8 months before the attack. And your father never mentioned any artifacts to you? Lucy shook her head. Pa wasn't one for tall tales. If he found something strange, he'd have kept it quiet until he knew what it was. Carson moved to the gun rack, selecting a rifle and checking its action. Miss Simmons, I need you to find Reverend Miller. Tell him to gather everyone at the church. Don't cause panic, but make sure they understand it's urgent. What are you going to do? Carson strapped on his gun belt. I'm going to search your father's store. If those artifacts are still in Silverton, we need to find them. And then we need to decide whether to destroy them or use them to understand what we're facing. You think they'll come back? It wasn't a question. Marshal Blackwood killed many of them, but he didn't get them all. And if these letters are right, there are more of these things elsewhere. Carson met her gaze steadily. Yes, Miss Simmons, I think they'll come back. After Lucy departed, Carson sent telegrams to the surrounding settlements, warning them to be on alert for any unusual activity. Then he headed for Simmons' general store, his mind racing with implications. If the government knew about these creatures before the Silverton attack, why had no warnings been issued? And if similar incidents had occurred elsewhere, how widespread was this hidden threat? The general store stood on a corner of Main Street, largely undamaged by the explosion that had consumed the town center. Carson entered cautiously, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, incongruous with his grim mood. The shop was meticulously organized. Lucy's doing, no doubt. Carson began his search in the back office, where Harold Simmons had kept his records and personal effects. If the old shopkeeper had hidden something valuable or dangerous, it would be here. After an hour of careful searching, Carson found nothing unusual. He was about to give up when he noticed that the office's plank flooring didn't quite meet the wall in one corner. Kneeling, he pried at the edge with his knife. The board came up easily, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal box, about the size of a large book. It was constructed of a dull grey material that didn't look quite like iron or steel. No lock secured it, just a simple latch mechanism. Carson hesitated, remembering Dr. Walsh's letter and its warnings. Whatever this contained, it had caught the attention of university professors and apparently the War Department. He should probably wait, gather witnesses before opening it. But time might be short. If the creatures were preparing another attack, he flipped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, lay an object that defied easy description. At first glance, it resembled a mask, roughly face-shaped with openings that might accommodate eyes and a mouth, but the proportions were wrong for a human face. The eye holes were too far apart, the mouth opening vertical rather than horizontal. The eye material was the same dull grey as the box, but as Carson stared at it, he realized it wasn't entirely solid. The surface seemed to shift subtly, almost flowing, though the overall shape remained constant. Most disturbing were the markings etched into its surface, symbols similar to those Daniel Spencer had described in his journal. They seemed to crawl across the mask's surface when viewed peripherally, becoming stationary only when directly observed. As Carson reached toward it, the mask began to emit a soft, pulsing glow, a greenish light that cast eerie shadows across. The office. A low humming sound filled the air. Just at the threshold of hearing, Carson snatched his hand back. The glow faded immediately. The humming ceased. What in God's name? He closed the box carefully, tucking it under his arm. Whatever this thing was, he needed to show it to the town council. Together, they could decide its fate. As he stepped onto the boardwalk outside the store, Carson noticed how quickly the afternoon shadows were lengthening. Winter was approaching, and with it, longer nights. Longer hours of darkness, during which those things could move freely, if Blackwood's theory about their aversion to sunlight was correct. The church bell began to toll, Reverend Miller gathering, the townspeople as requested. Carson quickened his pace, the box heavy under his arm. He never saw the figure watching from the alley across the street. A tall man in a black suit and bowler hat, his face unnaturally pale, his eyes hidden behind smoked glasses despite the fading light. As Carson disappeared around the corner, the figure stepped onto the street, moving with a peculiar gliding gait, and began to follow. The interior of St. Mary's Church was crowded with anxious faces when Carson arrived. Nearly everyone remaining in Silverton had answered the summons. Perhaps 60 people in all, a stark reminder of how many had been lost. Reverend Miller, a gaunt man who had aged decades in the past 3 months, stood at the pulpit. "Sheriff Carson has called this meeting," he announced, as Carson made his way to the front. "I trust you all will give him your full attention." Carson set the metal box on the altar and faced the congregation. 3 months ago, Marshal Blackwood gave his life to save as many of us as he could from a threat most of us didn't believe was real, until it was almost too late. He bought us time, but I believe that time may be running out. He explained about the letters, about the possibility that the government and academic institutions knew more about these creatures than they had shared. He told them about similar incidents in other regions, suggesting a pattern rather than an isolated event. The Spencer Mining Company uncovered something in Shadow Mountain, he continued. Something these creatures wanted badly enough to slaughter an entire wagon train and half our town to retrieve. I believe I found one of those artifacts. He opened the box, revealing the strange mask. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. As the object began to glow again, the humming noise now loud enough that everyone could hear it. "What is that thing?" someone called out. "I don't know," Carson admitted, "but I suspect it's some kind of communication device, or perhaps a key." "A key to what?" Reverend Miller asked, eyeing the mask warily. "To wherever these things came from, or to something they left behind." From the back of the church came a new voice, cultured, with an Eastern accent. "Very astute, Sheriff Carson. All heads turned to see a tall man in a black suit standing in the doorway. His skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent, his eyes hidden behind smoked glasses. He removed his bowler hat, revealing hair so blonde it appeared white. "My name is Agent Thomas Reed, United States Secret Service." The man produced an official-looking badge. "I'm here on behalf of the federal government to collect that artifact and any others you may have discovered." Carson's hand moved to his revolver. Something about this man felt wrong. "You've got some explaining to do first, Agent Reed. If the government knew about these creatures, why weren't we warned?" Reed smiled thinly. "That information is classified, Sheriff. Suffice it to say, the situation is more complex than you realize. Now, the artifact, please." "No." The word came not from Carson, but from Lucy Simmons, who had risen from her pew. "My father died because of secrets. We all lost people we loved. We deserve answers." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Reed's smile vanished. "This is a matter of national security. I am authorized to seize the artifact by force if necessary." Carson drew his revolver. "You're outnumbered, Agent Reed, and I'm not convinced you are who you claim to be." Reed tilted his head, an oddly mechanical gesture. "A regrettable choice, Sheriff. What happened next occurred so quickly that many witnesses later disagreed on the exact sequence of events." Reed moved with inhuman speed, crossing the church. In seconds, Carson fired twice, both bullets striking the agent's chest without apparent effect. Reed seized the mask from its box, the glow intensifying to a blinding radiance. He placed it against his face, and where the two touched, a strange melding occurred, as if the mask and Reed's features were flowing together. The church erupted in chaos. People scrambled for exits as Reed, or what had been Reed, began to change. His limbs elongated, his suit tearing at the seams, his head expanded, the smoked glasses falling away to reveal what lay beneath, not eyes, but vertical slits that opened to expose needle-like teeth. Carson emptied his revolver into the transforming figure, with no more effect than his first shots. The creature that had been Reed extended an impossibly long arm, seizing Carson by the throat and lifting him from the ground. Its mouth opened in that vertical configuration Blackwood had described, and it spoke, the words, a hissing approximation of English. "You have interfered for the last time, human. The harvest will continue, the gateway will open, the ascension cannot be stopped." As consciousness began to fade, Carson glimpsed movement behind the creature, Lucy Simmons, wielding a heavy brass crucifix from the altar. She brought it down on the creature's arm with all her strength. There was a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly Carson was free, crumpling to the floor. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered every window in the church. The arm that Lucy had struck was leaking that strange, luminous fluid Blackwood had described. It turned on her, its movements now jerky, uncoordinated. "Run!" Carson gasped, scrambling to his feet, but Lucy stood her ground, crucifix raised like a weapon. "The brass," she said. "It hurts it." The revelation sparked through Carson's mind. Brass, an alloy of copper and zinc, nothing special or magical. But to these creatures somehow toxic. "Everyone with brass," he shouted. "Buttons, jewelry, anything." Several men rushed forward, one wielding a pair of brass knuckles, another a decorative letter opener with a brass handle. They swarmed the creature from different angles, each strike eliciting those glass-breaking shrieks. The creature that had been Agent Reed staggered toward the door, the mask now fully fused with its face. Despite its injuries, it moved with purpose, as if executing a predetermined plan. It paused at the threshold, turning back to face the humans pursuing it. "The gateway opens with the solstice," it hissed. 3 days, then all fall to darkness. Then it was gone, moving with that unnatural speed into the gathering dusk. Carson leaned against a pew, breathing heavily. "Is everyone all right?" There were minor injuries, bruises, cuts from broken glass, but miraculously no deaths. The creature had been focused on retrieving the mask, not slaughter. What did it mean about a gateway? Reverend Miller asked, helping a woman to her feet. And the solstice? Winter solstice is in 3 days, Lucy said quietly. The longest night of the year. Carson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air seeping through the broken windows. Whatever these things are planning, it happens then. But what can we do? Someone asked. We barely drove off one of them. We know they can. Be hurt now, Carson replied. Brass wounds them, fire kills them, sunlight repels them. He looked around at the frightened but resolute faces. And we know where they're coming from. Shadow Mountain. Understanding dawned in Lucy's eyes. You want to take the fight to them? Carson nodded grimly. Marshal Blackwood bought us 3 months with his sacrifice. I won't waste it waiting for these things to come back in greater numbers. He straightened, decision made. I'll lead a party to Shadow Mountain tomorrow. We'll find this gateway and destroy it before the solstice. That's suicide, Reverend Miller protested. Staying here might be worse, Carson countered. If that thing was telling the truth, something happens. On the solstice that will make our previous encounter look like a skirmish. A heavy silence fell over the assembly. Then one by one, men began to step forward, miners, shopkeepers, ranchers, not trained fighters, but men who had already lost too much to surrender without a struggle. I'll go, said a burly blacksmith, named Peterson. Got plenty of brass in my shop. Can forge some proper weapons by morning. Count me in, added Michael Taylor, who had lost 3 brothers in the massacre. I've worked those mines for 10 years, know them better than most. By nightfall, 20 men had volunteered for what might well be a suicide mission. Carson sent telegrams to the nearest military outposts, explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance, though he held little hope of a response in time. As the meeting broke up, Lucy approached Carson. I'm coming too. Absolutely not. Her eyes flashed. That thing killed my father, and I was the one who discovered brass hurts them. You need me. Carson wanted to refuse, to insist she stay safely in town with the other women and children. But the determination in her face told him it would be futile. Besides, she had proven her courage and quick thinking already. First sign of real trouble, you fall back, he said finally. That's non-negotiable. She nodded, though they both knew. It was an empty condition. Where they were going, there would be no falling back, no safe retreat. As darkness claimed Silverton completely, Sheriff James Carson stood on the church steps, watching the silhouette of Shadow Mountain against the star-filled sky. Somewhere, beneath that looming mass, creatures not of this earth were preparing for something momentous. A gateway opening, an ascension beginning. Whatever it was, Carson was determined to stop it. Marshal Blackwood had given his life to save this town. Carson was prepared to do the same to save whatever came next. In the blacksmith shop, metal rang against metal as Peterson began forging brass into weapons. In homes throughout Silverton, men said what might be final goodbyes to wives and children. And in the shadows between buildings, pale figures watched and waited, their vertical mouth slits opening and closing in silent communication. The final battle for Shadow Mountain was about to begin. Dawn broke over Silverton with reluctant grey, light filtering through heavy snow clouds. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and a bitter wind whipped down from Shadow Mountain, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Sheriff Carson stood outside Peterson's blacksmith shop, watching the volunteers gather. 22 men and Lucy Simmons, each grim-faced and bundled against the cold. They carried an assortment of weapons, rifles and shotguns, of course, but also brass implements hastily fashioned in Peterson's forge, knuckles, spikes, even crude bladed weapons with brass edges. Not exactly an army, murmured Michael Taylor. adjusting the brass-tipped pickaxe strapped to his back. "We work with what we have," Carson replied, checking his own modified weapons. He'd had Peterson attach brass plates to his revolver bullets, a painstaking process that had consumed most of the night. Whether they would fire accurately remained to be seen. Peterson emerged from his shop, carrying what appeared to be a primitive flamethrower, a converted mining pump connected to a tank of kerosene with a brass nozzle and ignition mechanism. "Finished it just now," the blacksmith announced, hoisting the contraption. "Range is only about 15 feet, but it should cook those bastards properly." Carson nodded approvingly. "Remember, we move in teams. No one goes anywhere alone. If you see one of those things, don't try to be a hero. Alert your team and fall back to the main group." "Any word from the military outposts?" Lucy asked, adjusting a belt of brass tools around her waist. Carson shook his head. "Telegraph lines went down overnight. Might be the storm. Might be—" He left the alternative unspoken. If the creatures had cut the lines, they were isolating Silverton deliberately. "We should move out," Taylor urged, eyeing the mountain. 6 hours climb at least, and daylight's precious this time of year." Carson couldn't argue with that logic. The winter solstice meant barely 9 hours of daylight. They needed to reach the mine entrance before dark if possible. "Mount up," he ordered, "and stay alert. I doubt these things will wait passively for us to reach their doorstep." The expedition set out on horseback, following the same trail Marshal Blackwood had taken 3 months earlier. The going was slow, the path partially obscured by early winter snow and debris from autumn storms. Carson rode at the front, with Taylor and Peterson flanking him. Lucy stayed in the middle of the group, though Carson noted she kept one hand always near the brass-handled knife at her belt. As they climbed higher, the wind intensified, driving snow into their faces and reducing visibility to mere yards. Communication became impossible except through hand signals or shouting directly into a neighbor's ear. "Storm's not natural," Taylor yelled to Carson as they rounded a particularly exposed bend. "Never seen one blow up so fast." Carson had been thinking the same thing. The abrupt weather change, the downed telegraph lines. It felt orchestrated, designed to isolate and hinder them. They reached Widow's Creek by midday, the halfway point to the mine. Carson called a brief halt, allowing the horses to rest and the men to choke down cold rations. No fires, not with the wind and not when flames might alert the enemy to their position. "We've been watching since we left town," Lucy said quietly as she crouched beside Carson beneath a rocky overhang. "Don't look now, but there's something moving along that ridge to the east." Carson waited a moment, then casually scanned the indicated direction. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a shape materialized briefly. Tall, impossibly thin, moving with that fluid grace Blackwood had described. It vanished almost, instantly melting into the white landscape. "They're tracking us," he confirmed, "probably reporting our progress to whatever passes for their leaders. Why not attack? They must outnumber us. Maybe they're wary after what Blackwood did to them, or maybe—" "They want us to reach the mountain," Lucy finished, her eyes widening. The possibility sent an icy finger down Carson's spine. "We could be walking into a trap, or they might need us for something. That thing that looked like Agent Reed said the ascension requires the gateway. What if opening this gateway needs sacrifices?" Carson considered this grim theory. It made a terrible kind of sense. The creatures had shown they could harvest humans at will. Taking the entire town would have been easier than this elaborate winter solstice plan. "We proceed," he decided after a moment, "but with even more caution, and we prepare for the possibility that reaching the mine is exactly what they want." They resumed their journey, the wind now at their backs as they climbed, toward Shadow Mountain's upper slopes. The storm began to ease around mid-afternoon, the snow tapering off and visibility improving. Carson wasn't sure if this was a good sign or simply another phase of whatever game the creatures were playing. As they approached the final ascent to Spencer Shaft number 7, Carson called another halt. "We'll leave the horses here," he announced. "Continue. On foot. Less noise, and they won't be much use in the tunnels anyway." They secured the animals in a natural shelter formed by a rock overhang, leaving enough feed and water for 2 days. If the expedition hadn't returned by then, the horses would be the least of their concerns. "Listen up," Carson addressed the group. "From here on, absolute silence unless absolutely necessary. We don't know what waits inside that mine, but assume it's ready for us. Peterson, your flamethrower ready?" The blacksmith nodded, patting the contraption strapped to his back. "Taylor, you know these tunnels. You'll guide us once we're inside. Lucy, stay with me. Everyone else, teams of 3, just as we practiced." The final approach to the mine entrance was eerily quiet. No birds, no small animals, exactly as Blackwood had described the Wagon Massacre site. Nature itself seemed to have abandoned this place. The mine entrance stood just as Blackwood had reported, a dark rectangle in the mountainside, shored up with timbers. The sign above now hung by a single nail, creaking softly in the wind. "Spencer Silver, Shaft number 7. Carson signaled the group to halt at a safe distance, while he and Taylor approached the entrance cautiously, weapons ready. There were no footprints. In the fresh snow before the mine, neither human nor the strange, elongated prints of the creatures. If anything waited inside, it had been there since before the storm. "Seems clear," Taylor whispered. "But there's something wrong." "What? It's not right. Should be cold air flowing out from the mountain this time of year. Instead it feels—" He reached a hand toward the entrance. "Warm. And there's a smell." Carson detected it too. That same musky odor Blackwood had described in his last moments. Like nothing found in nature, a scent that seemed to bypass the nose and register directly in the primitive hindbrain, triggering instinctive revulsion. He signaled the others forward while he and Taylor maintained watch on the entrance. As they assembled, Carson outlined the plan one last time. "Taylor leads, Peterson and his flamethrower right behind him. I'll bring up the rear with Lucy and Jenkins. If those things attack, form a circle. Protect the flamethrower at all costs. It's our best weapon in confined spaces." "And if we find this gateway," Peterson asked, "we destroy it, with explosives if necessary." Carson patted the satchel of dynamite strapped to his belt, salvaged from the mining warehouse after Blackwood's last stand. "We've got enough here to collapse half the mountain." With grim nods all around, the party lit their lanterns and entered Spencer Shaft number 7, weapons at the ready. The unnatural warmth enveloped them immediately, along with that alien scent, stronger now than outside. The main shaft extended straight into the mountain, just as Blackwood had described it in his final report to the town council. Taylor led them forward cautiously, stopping occasionally to check for structural weaknesses or signs of recent activity. The tunnel showed evidence of hasty abandonment, tools left where they had fallen, a half-eaten meal mouldering on a small table, a jacket still hanging from a peg. "The new section should be just ahead," Taylor whispered, after they'd progressed about 50 yards. "That's where Blackwood reported finding the entrance to the natural cave system." As they approached the junction, the air grew warmer still, the strange odor more intense. Carson signaled a halt, listening intently. At first, he heard nothing beyond the breathing of his companions and the occasional creak of the tunnel supports. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the mountain, rhythmic sounds, like distant drums or machinery in steady operation. "You hear that?" he whispered to Taylor. The miner nodded. "Coming from the new section, never heard anything like it before." They proceeded with greater caution, entering the newer tunnel that sloped downward at a steep angle. The drumming sound grew louder, now accompanied by what might have been chanting in an inhuman language. Those same whispered sounds, Blackwood had reported. The tunnel widened into the chamber where Blackwood had found Daniel Spencer's journal and maps. The mining equipment remained scattered across the floor, now coated with a fine layer of crystalline material that glistened in the lantern light. The table where Spencer had kept his records was gone. But most disturbing was what had been added. The walls were now covered with those same unnerving symbols that had adorned the mask, etched into the rock and filled with a substance that glowed with that same greenish light. They formed patterns that seemed to shift when not directly observed, creating the unsettling impression that the very walls were alive and watching. Jesus, Peterson breathed, raising his lantern higher. What is all this? Some kind of writing, Lucy suggested, moving closer to one wall. Or mathematics, maybe. Look how the patterns repeat, but with subtle variations. Don't touch anything, Carson warned, surveying the chamber for immediate threats. Finding none, he pointed to the far corner where Blackwood had reported finding the entrance to the natural cave system. That's our target. The natural passage was now significantly altered. What had been a rough-hewn opening was now an elaborately carved archway, its surface covered with the glowing symbols. The arch framed absolute darkness, a void so complete it seemed to swallow the lantern light rather than be illuminated by it. As they approached this disturbing portal, the drumming and chanting grew louder, now clearly emanating from whatever lay beyond. Carson signaled the group to extinguish all but one lantern, no sense announcing their presence more than necessary. "I'll go first," Taylor whispered, removing his hat and wiping nervous sweat from his brow, despite the chill that had inexplicably replaced the earlier warmth. "Right behind you," Carson assured him, checking his modified revolver one last time. Taylor took a deep breath and stepped through the archway, immediately disappearing as if swallowed by the darkness. Peterson followed, the tank of his flamethrower clanking softly against the rock. One by one, the rescue party entered the passage, each vanishing into that unnatural blackness. Carson went last, with Lucy just ahead of him. As he crossed the threshold, a sensation of vertigo seized him, as if he were falling despite his feet remaining firmly on solid ground. The darkness was absolute, disorienting, and for several terrifying seconds he felt completely alone, cut off from his companions who had preceded him by mere feet. Then, abruptly, he was through, emerging into a space so vast his lantern couldn't illuminate its boundaries. The others waited just ahead, frozen in stunned silence as they stared upward. Carson followed their gaze and felt his heart seize in his chest. They stood at the edge of an immense cavern, far larger than anything natural erosion could have created beneath Shadow Mountain. Its ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, supported by columns that resembled no architectural style Carson had ever seen. Twisted, organic forms that branched and rejoined in patterns that defied human aesthetic understanding. But it was what occupied the center of this impossible space that robbed the breath from Carson's lungs, a structure that could only be the gateway. It rose at least 50 feet tall, a perfect circle of that same strange metal as the mask, suspended between massive pylons that pulsed with greenish light. Within the circle was not stone or open space, but something else entirely, a shimmering, undulating surface, like liquid mercury held vertical against gravity. Occasional ripples disturbed its mirror-like surface, and through these momentary distortions, Carson caught glimpses of somewhere else, a landscape of bizarre geometries and colors that had no names in human language, beneath a sky that seemed to be watching, aware. Surrounding this nightmarish portal were dozens of the creatures, arranged in concentric circles. Some knelt in what might have been prayer, others stood with arms raised toward the gateway, producing that rhythmic chanting. At the very center, directly before the portal, stood a figure different from the rest, taller, adorned with what appeared to be ceremonial garments constructed of the same flowing metal as the gateway itself, and arrayed on stone altars before. This central figure were human bodies, dozens of them, including the missing townsfolk from Silverton and what Carson presumed were the remains of the wagon train victims. They weren't dead, at least not all of them. Some moved feebly, others lay still but breathing. All had been modified in some way. Limbs elongated, torsos opened and reconfigured with pieces of that strange technology embedded within their flesh. "They're changing them," Lucy whispered, horror evident in her voice. "Making them like themselves." Carson's mind raced, trying to process the implications. These weren't just invaders from some hidden underground civilization. They were transforming humans, perhaps preparing them for, what, colonization, infiltration. The sudden memory of Agent Reed and his transformation sent a chill through Carson. How many others like him might already exist, walking among humanity in populated cities, their true nature concealed? His strategic assessment was grim. The rescue party was outnumbered at least 5-1. The creatures hadn't noticed them, yet so focused were they on their ritual. But discovery was inevitable once they moved deeper into the cavern. "We need a plan," he whispered to the others, who had drawn into a tight huddle in the shadow of the passage entrance. "That gateway is clearly their objective. If we can destroy it, how?" Peterson hissed. "There must be 60 of those things between us and it." "Distraction," Taylor suggested. "Split their attention, create chaos." Carson nodded slowly, an idea forming. "Peterson, can your flamethrower reach those support structures from a closer position?" The blacksmith studied the nearest pylon. "If I can get within 30 yards, maybe. What are you thinking?" "Fire creates panic, even among them." "Taylor, take 4 men and plant explosives on those far columns. Peterson, you and I will create a diversion near the main group. Once the charges are set, we light them up, then fall back immediately through this passage. With luck, we collapse their getaway and escape before they recover." "What about the prisoners?" Lucy asked, gesturing toward the altered humans. "We can't just leave them." Carson met her gaze steadily. "Look at them, Lucy. Really look. Whatever those people were, I don't think they exist anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. The modifications weren't merely physical. The vacant stares, the mindless movements. These were no longer fully human, but rather tools being prepared for some alien purpose. "Let's move," Carson ordered. "Stay in the shadows along the cavern wall. No unnecessary risks." The group split as planned, with Taylor leading his team toward the far side of the chamber, while Carson, Peterson, Lucy, and the remaining men crept along the nearer wall. The ritual continued unabated, the chanting growing more intense, the gateway's surface rippling more frequently. Through one such ripple, Carson caught sight of something moving on the other side, a massive shape, pushing against the membrane, separating it from our world. Whatever the ascension entailed, it appeared to involve bringing something through from that other place. They had nearly reached their planned position when disaster struck. One of Taylor's men, navigating a particularly narrow ledge, lost his footing. He didn't fall far, perhaps 10 feet, but the echo of his landing and startled cry reverberated throughout the cavern. The chanting stopped instantly. As one, the creatures turned toward the sound, those vertical mouth slits opening to reveal rows of needle teeth. "Now!" Carson shouted, abandoning stealth. "Peterson, light them up!" The blacksmith didn't hesitate. He aimed his makeshift flamethrower at the nearest group of creatures and triggered the ignition. A stream of burning kerosene shot forth, catching 3 of the beings in its path. They shrieked, that same glass-breaking sound Blackwood had described, as flames engulfed their pale forms. Chaos erupted throughout the cavern. The creatures scattered, some rushing toward the intruders, while others maintained their positions near the gateway, as if unwilling or unable to abandon their ritual. The central figure raised its arms higher, its chanting growing frantic. Carson fired his modified revolver at the approaching creatures, the brass-plated bullets finding their marks with satisfying effect. Where standard ammunition had merely inconvenienced these beings, the brass caused visible damage, smoking wounds that leaked luminous fluid. The battle spread throughout the chamber, individual skirmishes breaking out as the creatures located all the human intruders. Taylor's men worked frantically to place their explosives, fighting off attacks as they did so. Lucy proved surprisingly effective in combat, her smaller size allowing her to duck beneath the creature's reaching arms and strike at vulnerable areas with her brass-edged weapons. She fought her way toward one of the altars, perhaps still hoping to save whoever remained of the modified humans. Peterson kept the largest concentration of creatures at bay with sweeping arcs of flame, but Carson could see the tank on his back was depleting rapidly. They had minutes at most before their primary weapon was exhausted. "Taylor!" Carson shouted across the cavern. "Status! Charges set!" came the distant reply. "Ready to blow on your signal." Carson surveyed the battlefield, making a rapid assessment. They'd caused significant damage, but casualties were mounting on their side as well. At least 3 men were down, possibly dead. The creatures, despite their vulnerabilities to brass and fire, were regrouping, their initial surprise fading, and the gateway, it was changing. The shimmering surface had begun to solidify, becoming more defined. Through it, Carson could now clearly see a landscape of impossible geometries, and moving across that landscape, approaching the boundary between worlds, was a shape so vast and alien that his mind struggled to process its dimensions or form. The ascension was imminent. Whatever lay on the other side of that portal was about to cross into our world. "Fall back," Carson ordered. "Everyone to the passage. Taylor, blow those charges as soon as we're clear." Peterson provided covering fire as the survivors began retreating toward the exit. Lucy had reached one of the altars and was attempting to free a young woman, one of the Silverton shopkeepers who had gone missing during the initial attack. But the woman's modifications were extensive. Her limbs fused to the altar itself through some horrible melding of flesh and metal. "Lucy, we have to go," Carson shouted, fighting his way toward her. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave her like this. I can't." The shopkeeper's eyes, still human despite the alien modifications to her body, focused briefly on Lucy. Her mouth moved, forming words with obvious effort. "Kill me." Carson reached them, grabbing Lucy's arm. "We can't save them, but we can make sure no one else suffers this fate." Lucy hesitated, then nodded. With a swift, merciful movement, she drove her brass knife into the woman's heart. "I'm sorry," she whispered as the light faded from the shopkeeper's eyes. They retreated together, rejoining the main group, now clustered at the passage entrance. Taylor had the detonator ready, his finger poised above the plunger. "Wait," Carson ordered, turning back to face the cavern one last time. The gateway was now fully active, its surface solidified into a stable connection between worlds. The massive shape on the other side had reached the threshold, a limb or appendage, impossible to conceptualize in human terms, beginning to push through. The central figure, the leader of the creatures, turned toward the retreating humans, its vertical mouth opening in what might have been rage or triumph. It spoke, the words distorted but recognizable as the same voice that had emerged from Agent Reed. "Too late, humans. The ascension begins. Our masters return. Your world ends tonight." Carson met its gaze steadily. "Not tonight," he replied, then nodded to Taylor. "Blow it." The explosions came in rapid sequence, each charge detonating with ear-shattering force. The cavern's support columns began to crumble, massive chunks of ceiling raining down throughout the chamber. The creatures shrieked in alarm, many caught beneath the falling debris, but Carson's attention remained fixed on the gateway. The explosions, had destabilized its supporting pylons, sending cracks through the perfect circle of alien metal. The portal's surface began to fluctuate wildly, ripples becoming violent distortions. The thing attempting to cross through was caught, half emerged, a horror of impossible geometries trapped between worlds. It emitted no sound, but Carson felt its agony as a pressure inside his skull, a pain so intense it drove several of the retreating party to their knees. The leader of the creatures rushed toward the failing gateway, arms outstretched as if to physically hold it together. But the damage was done. With a sound like reality itself tearing, the portal collapsed in upon itself, taking with it both the partially emerged entity and the desperate leader. The implosion created a vacuum that pulled everything nearby toward the space where the gateway had stood. Loose debris, smaller creatures, even some of the horrifically modified humans still strapped to their altars. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped, leaving only a smoking crater where the portal had been. "Run!" Carson shouted as the entire cavern began to collapse, the destruction of the gateway apparently triggering a chain reaction throughout the structure. "Back through the passage!" They fled, Taylor bringing up the rear this time, firing, his shotgun at pursuing creatures. The passage itself seemed to be destabilizing, its walls closing in like a throat contracting. Carson could swear he felt the mountain itself trying to expel them, or perhaps consume them. Lucy stumbled, nearly falling, as the ground beneath them shook violently. Carson caught her arm, dragging her forward as a section of ceiling collapsed. Just behind them, crushing one of the creatures that had nearly reached them, they emerged from the unnatural darkness of the passage into the relative normality of the mining chamber, still running at full tilt. The glowing symbols on the walls were fading, the crystalline material that had coated the floor crumbling to dust. "Keep moving!" Carson urged as they reached the main shaft. "The whole mine could be coming down!" They sprinted up the sloping tunnel toward daylight, the sounds of collapse growing louder behind them. Taylor had fallen behind, weighed down by a wounded comrade slung across his shoulders. Carson dropped back to help, taking one side of the injured man, while Taylor supported the other. "Almost there," Carson gasped as the distant square of light, marking the entrance, grew larger. Just a little further. Behind them, the newer tunnel imploded with a roar, sending a cloud of dust billowing up the main shaft. The shockwave propelled them forward the last few yards, literally blasting them out of the mine entrance and onto the snow-covered ground outside. Carson rolled onto his back, gasping for air as dust and smoke poured from the mine entrance. A final, massive rumble shook the mountainside, and then silence fell, broken only by the labored breathing of the survivors. He sat up slowly, taking stock. Of the 23 who had entered the mine, only 14 remained. Peterson lay nearby, his flamethrower crushed, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle, but his chest still rising and falling. Lucy sat huddled against a rock, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, but her eyes clear and alert. Taylor was helping the wounded, moving from man to man with what remained of their medical supplies. "Did we do it?" Lucy asked, her voice hoarse from dust and shouting. "Is it over?" Carson looked back at the mine entrance, now partially collapsed and still issuing tendrils of smoke. "The gateway is destroyed. Whatever was coming through is either gone or trapped between worlds. I'd say we won this round." "This round?" Taylor asked, joining them with canteens of water. "You heard what their leader said. Our masters. These things. They're just servants of something worse." Carson accepted a canteen, drinking deeply before continuing. "And there will be others. Different. Mountains, different mines. We've stopped them here, but the threat remains." "So what now?" Lucy asked. Carson looked west, where the sun was setting behind distant peaks, casting long shadows across the valley below. Silverton lay there, still standing, still human. For now at least, they had preserved that small fragment of civilization. "Now we warn everyone who will listen," he replied firmly. The telegraph, newspapers, the government. Though after meeting Agent Reed, I'm not sure how far up this conspiracy goes, but people need to know what's out there, what's below. Shadow Mountain isn't unique. There will be other gateways, other attempts. As they gathered their strength and prepared to retrieve their horses for the journey back to town, Carson cast one final glance at the collapsed mine entrance. They had won a victory today, but at terrible cost. Marshal Blackwood, the wagon train victims, the townsfolk transformed into those monstrous hybrids. All casualties in a war most of humanity didn't even know was being waged. Yet amid the tragedy, there was hope. They had discovered the creature's weaknesses. They had proven these things could be fought and could be defeated. And most importantly, they had shown that humans, ordinary men and women with courage and determination, could stand against horrors from beyond their understanding and emerge victorious. The sun vanished behind the mountains, plunging Shadow Mountain into darkness. But to the east, the first stars were appearing, pinpoints of light in the gathering night, and tomorrow the days would begin to lengthen again. The winter solstice would pass, and gradually light would reclaim dominance over darkness. As they began their descent toward Silverton and the uncertain future that awaited them all, Sheriff James Carson made a silent promise to the memory of Marshal Ethan Blackwood and all others who had fallen. The story of Shadow Mountain would be told. The warning would be spread, and humanity would be ready when the creatures tried again. They had to be. The alternative was unthinkable. 3 years had passed since the battle at Shadow Mountain. Silverton had rebuilt once more, its population slowly growing as new miners and merchants arrived, drawn by tales of rich silver veins and opportunity. Few knew the true history of the town's destruction and rebirth. Sheriff James Carson preferred it that way. He sat at his desk, reviewing reports from neighboring settlements. Spring had come early this year, the mountain passing clearing weeks ahead of schedule. Soon, the first wagon trains would arrive, bringing supplies and new arrivals. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting aside the papers. Lucy Peterson entered, formerly Lucy Simmons, now married to the blacksmith who had fought alongside them beneath the mountain. The scar on her forehead had faded to a thin white line, but the memories behind her eyes remained sharp as ever. "Telegram came for you," she said, handing him a yellow slip. "From Washington." Carson's expression darkened as he read the message. "They're still stonewalling us. The War Department claims no knowledge of any Agent Reed or government investigations into Shadow Mountain." "Are you surprised?" Lucy asked, taking the chair opposite his desk. "After what we found in that cavern, how high do you think this goes?" Carson had spent the past 3 years trying to answer that question. His initial attempts to alert authorities about the creatures had met with dismissal, ridicule, and eventually thinly veiled threats. Newspaper editors refused to publish his accounts. Military officials denied receiving his reports. The scientific community labeled him a hoaxer or madman. Only Professor Holloway from Denver University had shown genuine interest, traveling to Silverton to interview survivors and examine the brass weapons that had proven effective against the creatures. His subsequent disappearance 6 months later, officially attributed to a hiking accident, had only deepened Carson's suspicions about powerful forces working to suppress the truth. "We're on our own," Carson concluded. Not for the first time. "Have you heard from Taylor?" Lucy nodded. "Telegram last week. He's established his network in 4 more mining towns. If anything unusual happens, we'll know about it." Michael Taylor had taken their warning mission on the road, creating a loose alliance of frontier settlements prepared to recognize and combat the creature threat. They called themselves the Vigil, communicating through coded telegraph messages and trusted couriers. "Any news from the Ute Reservation?" Carson asked. "Mountain Shadow sent this." Lucy withdrew a small leather pouch from her pocket. "He says it's for protection." Carson opened the pouch, finding a small brass amulet inscribed with symbols reminiscent of those they'd seen in the cavern, but subtly different. The old Ute shaman had proven an invaluable ally, sharing his tribe's generations of knowledge about the cold ones who dwell below. "There's something else," Lucy said, her voice dropping. "Peterson found something yesterday while expanding the new smithy foundation. He wanted you to see it privately." Carson followed her through the quiet morning streets to the blacksmith shop at the edge of town. Peterson was waiting, his massive frame silhouetted against the forge fire. "Show him," Lucy said. Peterson led them to a corner of the newly excavated foundation. "Was digging the support post hole when I hit something hard. Thought it was just rock at first, but..." He uncovered a metal object partially embedded in the soil, a piece of the same strange, flowing material as the gateway. About the size of a dinner plate, it pulsed with faint internal light when Carson's brass amulet came near. "There's more," Peterson said grimly. "This kind of material. It's been found in other places around town during rebuilding. Small pieces mostly. Folks thought they were just strange rocks or metal scraps. Brought them to me to identify." Carson knelt, studying the object without touching it. "They've been here all along," he murmured. "Not just under Shadow Mountain, under Silverton itself." "The whole town?" Lucy asked, horror evident in her voice. "Maybe. Or maybe just technology they left behind. Seeds planted for future use." Carson straightened. "Collect every piece you can find. Melt them down if possible, or seal them in brass containers if not." As Peterson covered the object again, Carson stepped outside, gazing toward Shadow Mountain. Its peak was still snow-covered despite the early spring, gleaming white against the blue sky. Beautiful, innocent-looking, but he knew better. The collapse of the mine and gateway had been a setback for the creatures, not an ending. Reports gathered by the vigil suggested similar incidents in remote areas across the frontier. Mysterious disappearances, strange footprints, whispers in the night. Isolated cases, disconnected to anyone not looking for the pattern. Lucy joined him. "You're thinking about Blackwood," Carson nodded. Marshal Ethan Blackwood had been the first to face this threat, the first to give his life fighting it. His sacrifice had bought them time and knowledge, the two resources most precious in this shadow war. "He'd be proud of what we've built," Lucy said. "The vigil, the preparations, the weapons. If they come again, we won't be caught unaware." "When," Carson corrected. "Not if, when." Back at his office, Carson unlocked a concealed cabinet behind his desk. Inside lay the accumulated evidence of 3 years' investigation. Journals, maps, sketches of the creatures and their technology, testimonies from survivors of similar incidents across the frontier. And at the center, in a sealed brass box, is Daniel Spencer's original journal and the letters between Professor Holloway and Dr. Walsh. Carson added his latest notes about the metal fragments found beneath the town, then relocked the cabinet. One copy of everything resided here. Others were distributed among trusted vigil members across the country. If anything happened to him, the knowledge wouldn't die. As night fell over Silverton, Carson made his usual rounds, nodding to citizens who had no idea of the vigil he maintained on their behalf. The town seemed peaceful, normal. Children played in front yards. Miners drank at the rebuilt saloon. A young couple strolled arm in arm beneath the stars. This was what they had fought for beneath Shadow Mountain. This fragile human world, imperfect, but precious, worth protecting, worth dying for if necessary. At the edge of town, Carson paused, looking back at the lights of Silverton and then up at the dark mass of Shadow Mountain silhouetted against the starry sky. Somewhere beneath that mountain, in tunnels and caverns untouched by the mine collapse, the surviving creatures might be regrouping, planning, waiting for another opportunity to open a gateway and summon their masters. And beyond Silverton, beyond even the frontier, lay the greater world of humanity, millions living in blissful ignorance of the threat that lurked beneath their feet. Cities and nations unprepared for enemies not from foreign shores, but from beneath their very foundations. The war had only just begun, and few even knew it was being fought. Carson touched the brass amulet at his throat and whispered the Ute protection. Prayer Mountain Shadow had taught him, not because he believed in magic, but because he believed in preparation, in vigilance, in the responsibility of those who know the truth to stand ready against the darkness. As he turned back toward town, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows, too tall and thin to be human. It vanished instantly, perhaps merely a trick of moonlight and imagination, or perhaps not. Carson kept his hand near his modified revolver, the brass-plated bullets ready, and he smiled grimly into the darkness. "I see you," he whispered, "and I'll be waiting." In the years that followed, the vigil grew quietly across America, preparing defenses for a war most would never know existed. Their symbol, a simple brass lantern, appeared in frontier towns and distant cities, marking safe houses and caches of weapons effective against the creatures. The Shadow Mountain incident faded into local legend, remembered as a mining disaster or Indian attack, depending on who told the tale. But the truth remained in carefully guarded records and in the nightmares of survivors. And deep beneath mountain ranges across the continent, in caverns untouched by human exploration, tall figures moved in darkness, whispering in their alien language, preparing for the day when the stars would align once more and new gateways could be opened. The Wagon Massacre that had begun this chapter was merely the first page in a longer story. A shadow war between humanity and something older, colder and infinitely patient. A war fought not with armies and cannons, but with brass weapons and forbidden knowledge, with sacrifice and courage in equal measure. A war that continues to this day in the dark places of the world, where strange footprints lead to hidden caves, and whispers echo in the darkness. Marshal Ethan Blackwood had followed those footprints into a nightmare and illuminated a threat few could comprehend. Sheriff James Carson had carried that light forward, building a network of defenders against an enemy that moved in shadows. And somewhere in America tonight, a new tracker follows strange footprints into darkness, continuing the vigil that began with a wagon massacre that left no survivors, but led to a truth that might one day save us all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and we'll check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.